Hello everyone, welcome to Worchester Street. I hope you enjoy your stay. I decided to give you guys a little bit of a change of pace for the intro, and I'm regretting it right now, because this place is creepy. This week my story is a little bit different than the ones you're used to, but I'm very proud of it, and I hope you enjoy it. Anyway. I really hope that's getting picked up. There's something screaming in the background, and I did not put anything in, if you can hear anything. But yeah, also I'm gonna go fast, because someone's coming after me, I think. I recorded a voiceover earlier, kind of summarizing it, and I'll let that play now.
This week, our story is a little different from our normal fare of horror and scares. We're transported to another world, with a radically different culture, one that is full of conflict, war, and magic. We follow a young woman named Scylla, who has been sent on a delicate diplomatic mission. Scylla is a new initiate at the School of Attraction. This school is a place where people come to learn to control the power of gravity and harness it from other kinds of energy in a process called shifting. This piece was written as a collaboration project with another creator, and I'm incredibly excited to show it to you. That being said, let's get started. Scylla sat on the deck of the airship, staring intently into the brazier that burned brightly in the early evening air. Romulus stood beside it, his arms folded. "Focus," Romulus said, in his thick Sylvan accent. "All forms of energy are the same. All light, all sound, all movement, all of them wish to become the force of attraction." He gestured towards the flames. "This light wishes to become—" Yeah, I get it, Romulus," Scylla said, a bead of sweat dripping down her forehead. "Believe it or not, I haven't already forgotten everything I learned at the school." Scylla closed her eyes, calmed her mind, then threw her hands together in a thunderous clap. She felt a thrill of energy run through her body, and when she opened her eyes, the flames from the brazier had been reduced to glowing coals. She shot a look to her left and saw that the sack of flour she'd been using as a practice weight was flying through the air, hovering high above the ship. She scrambled towards it and clapped her hands again. The sack fell hard, crashing in a heap to the floor and pinning her to the ground. Romulus gave a low chuckle from behind her. A soft snapping sound echoed from him, and the sack lifted up, hovering in the air. Scylla jumped to her feet and walked back towards Romulus. "Well done," Romulus said. "That was quite a heavy sack." "I'm quite pleased with your progress, Scylla. However, I am still displeased with your catalyst. Clapping your hands is hardly the best option for focusing your mind. I will not require you to emulate my catalyst," Romulus said, holding out his hand and snapping his fingers. The bag of flour that had been hovering in the air crashed to the floor at the sound. "But I do ask you to pick something that will not require both hands." Romulus was a huge, dark-skinned man, and also one of the elders in the School of Attraction. Scylla had been his pupil for just over a month now. She cringed at his words. He was right, but she found it incredibly difficult to break the habit of clapping her hands. "I'll make the change," Scylla said, looking down at her feet. "But, Romulus, don't you think it's time that I learn some offensive shifting? I know you'll expect me to respect the techniques, and I will." Romulus's dark eyes looked her over. "Not yet. Lifting bags of flour is one thing. Attraction shifting designed to cause damage requires more control than I've seen you perform." Scylla knew it'd be useless to argue, and let the point drop. "Fine. Thank you, Romulus." Romulus watched her for a long moment. "But, perhaps, a small demonstration is in order. Something you can expect to learn in the next 2 or 3 years. But I need your word that you will not attempt it without my supervision." Scylla felt a grin grow across her face. "Of course, I promise." Romulus pointed back towards the sack of flour, laying on the deck. "Lift that sack up above your head," he said. Scylla was 18, but she was a small girl, and was often mistaken as younger than she actually was. She struggled with the sack, but finally managed to raise it above her head. Romulus raised his right hand and snapped. The sack of flour grew light as a feather in her arms. Romulus held his left hand out, palm up, and snapped again. The air above his hand condensed into a small, hazy ball that darkened until it was almost black. "What is that?" Scylla asked. "All energy is the same," Romulus repeated. "I changed the attraction that was between the sack and the earth to be a universal attraction centered around a small point above my palm. It's highly concentrated, so the air clings together densely, meaning there's more air here than should be in the same place at once." Romulus snapped his right hand again, and the black ball of air zipped away from the airship. When it was something like 100 feet away, he snapped again. An enormous bang rang out, loud enough to make Scylla's ears ring. Romulus gave a rare smile. "More energy means more powerful ball of air." Scylla's jaw dropped. He'd made that explosion with nothing but just the weight of a sack of flour? "Teach me," she said. Romulus shook his head and turned back to the brazier. "I will only do so when you are ready. Why don't you head below decks and ask the captain if there's a task to do? It might give you an opportunity for further practice." Scylla sighed, but nodded. "Of course, Romulus." She bowed and turned her back on him, making her way across the deck of the ship, passing by the ballast tanks of core-infused air that kept the airship aloft. They hummed softly where they sat along the deck. Scylla opened a door and walked down steps towards the captain's chambers. The deeper Scylla walked into the ship, the worse the smell of dried alcohol and urine became, hitting her nose like a wave. She did her best not to gag. Scylla had been on the ship for just a week, so she'd only been able to piece together a few things about their mission. She was a member of the School of Attraction, and its master was a man named Merkin. From what she'd gathered through eavesdropping, Merkin was hoping to enter into a treaty to stop the war with the School of Sound. She didn't know what that was supposed to be all about, but that was to be expected. Scylla was a novice, and people rarely told novices anything. Scylla shook her head at Emery, the motionlessness of the corridor. She guided herself through the darkness with a hand on the wall until she reached the captain's quarters. Then she forced a smile to her face and knocked on his door. Captain Foran opened it, and Scylla did her best not to react to the wave of alcohol and sweat that radiated off him. "Captain Foran," she said, giving her most patronizing tone, "is there anything I can do to be of help on the ship?" Foran stood, swaying in the doorway, a bottle held loosely in his hand. "No, you stay away from my ship," he slurred. "I don't trust a single one of you." "I just want to help." "I don't care," he said. "Get shifted." Scylla felt her face grow red at the insult. Foran went to slam the heavy door closed, but before he could finish the motion, Scylla clapped her hands together. She felt energy coursing through her body, and the door's motion stopped suddenly. Foran shrieked, scrabbling at his eyes. "I'm blind! What did you do to me?" Scylla breathed heavily for a moment, regaining her composure. The door hadn't given her enough energy to do any real damage, but it was enough to make his eyelids weigh a few extra pounds. She turned around and strode back down the hallway, clapping again to release the shift she'd linked to his eyelids. Foran fell back into his chambers and slammed the door shut with a scramble. "I guess Romulus was right," Scylla thought. "It did give me an opportunity for practice." Scylla's walk ended at the front of the ship. The low guardrail installed at the edge was the only protection from the several thousand-foot fall. Scylla sat down on the edge of the ship and leaned against the guardrail, looking out towards the sunset. The desert landscape extended for hundreds of miles in front of her, but her eyes were still drawn to the Adala Plateau. It was still dozens of miles away, but it dominated the horizon, rising thousands of feet above the surrounding area. Everyone knew that flying near the Adala Plateau was asking for trouble from the Lightning Raiders. They were a violent group, schooled in the School of Lightning. The master of that school accepted any and all students, so if you were a bandit with aspirations, you came to the Adala Plateau and made your way through the school. Everyone who came through the School of Lightning was known for their brutality and lawlessness. They'd been getting more bold over the past few years, venturing out from their plateaus to attack shipping vessels like the one she rode on. Scylla felt the airship move slightly, making adjustments to give the plateau as wide a berth as possible. She sighed. Scylla had grown up under the protection of the School of Attraction, and that meant that the town she'd grown up in was occasionally raided by other schools looking to steal food, equipment, and especially core. She shuddered at the memory of the day when the School of Sound had attacked her town. Half of her family was still deaf from that day. And now this mission. A treaty with the School of Sound? The school that had killed her grandmother and deafened her father? She shook her head. Maybe it was for the best. Maybe this meant that there would be less raids. Yeah, right. Scylla knew that her family, her entire town, was nothing more than Merton's little pawn in his game of chess with the other leaders of the schools. Scylla spat off the edge of the ship and watched the white spittle fall for several long seconds before finally losing track of it far below in the sand. But what was there to do? She shut her eyes and breathed in and out heavily. She knew what she had to do. It was the reason she'd gone to the School of Attraction in the first place. She had to learn attraction shifting, master it, until nobody could ever hurt her or her family again. Scylla looked over the railing at the broken horizon and felt the determination grow in her stomach. She'd do whatever it took to become strong. Scylla stood up and walked to the hammock that she'd set up under the awning at the front of the boat. She watched the horizon, practiced snapping as a catalyst, and wrote in her journal until the sun set. Neither of the moons were out, so the sky was dark. After what seemed like an eternity, Scylla fell into an uneasy sleep. The next day was spent learning about how the airship worked. Romulus decided that having a base knowledge of nearly everything could be important, and Scylla figured he had a point. Romulus gave a tour of the command post, the place where the airship's pilot sat, and explained each lever. One controlled altitude, pitch, yaw, and another the alarms. Scylla wrote down what he explained in her notebook as he went along. Later that afternoon, she went through drills trying different motions as catalysts. When it came to shifting, it didn't actually matter what motion you used as a catalyst. Shifting was an entirely mental activity. Still, everyone but the most advanced shifters used them, and Romulus was no exception. Scylla tried flicking her fingers, snapping like Romulus did, and even clicking her teeth together. Nothing felt as natural as clapping, or as effective. Still, Romulus had a point. If an arm was tied up or broken, she didn't want to be useless as a shifter. They practiced on the deck in the view of the sailors. A few of the braver ones made jibes at her, but most kept their distance. They had long been taught that shifters were something to be feared and avoided at all costs. Their training had dragged into the late afternoon when Romulus called for a break. "Good," he said, pointing to the various stations where she'd made transfers between types of energy. Light to gravity, sound to gravity, heat to gravity. All were crude and heavy-handed, but she'd succeeded in making a link between all of them. "You have great promise, Scylla," he said. "But now we must eat." They moved into the shade, and Romulus brought out some of the supplies that he'd packed: dried meat, cheese, and some apples. Scylla tore into them greedily, the food delicious after the work she'd put in. "It is quite extraordinary, Scylla," Romulus said. "You were perhaps the first—" Romulus was cut off by the sound of crackling wood. Scylla spun around and saw a beam ripping through one of the tanks of core air that was keeping the airship aloft. The tank of core air exploded, and by the time the smoke cleared, Scylla could see the pillar of light already attacking another canister of core air. The beam disappeared, then reappeared farther down the deck, annihilating a sailor and blowing up apart another ballast tank of core air. Scylla looked up and saw an airship flying high above them. A huge rectangular sheet extended above the ship, soaking in the rays of the sun. The airship had several planks where several figures stood looking down. One of them pointed a finger down towards their ship, and a pillar of light erupted from it, instantly consuming more sailors on their airship. "It's the School of Light," Romulus shouted. He turned to Scylla. "Go to the control panel, and immediately disengage our core air ballast tanks. Drop our altitude as much as you can." Scylla nodded and jumped to her feet. Screams echoed from around her as pillars of fire ripped through the ship. Scylla jumped over one sailor, staring at his crisp and blackened legs dumbly. Scylla reached the control panel and pulled a lever that controlled altitude. The ship immediately began falling, accelerating faster and faster, until it ground to a halt suddenly. Scylla checked the gauges and saw that the power had been switched off. This ship should be falling, Scylla thought. Then she heard the explosions ring out from above her. She looked up to see that entire sections of the other airship were being blown apart. Then she looked back over the deck to where Romulus stood. His left arm was pointed towards the enemy ship. Black balls the size of her head orbited Romulus's arm in complex patterns. He snapped his right hand rapidly, and the black balls shot from him towards the other airship, where they exploded with an incredible sound. Romulus is using the energy of the ship, Scylla realized with a shock. He harnessed all the energy of this massive falling ship and turned it into these balls of air. Romulus fired the remaining balls that orbited his arm, then snapped again. The ship began to fall, and he turned to vomit something dark onto the deck. Then he held out a hand and snapped again, and the fall of the ship slowed and stopped. The School of Light's airship was in shambles, but it was still flying. As Scylla watched, several heads looked over the railings and began firing down again, their pillars of light tearing into the decks. Romulus began snapping again, more rapidly this time. With each snap, another black ball appeared around his left arm. They were smaller than the first massive black balls, but there were hundreds of them. Blood leaked from his eyes, ears, and nose, but he didn't stop snapping. He groaned and fell to a knee, his left hand hitting the deck to stop his fall. "Romulus!" Scylla screamed. He grunted and pushed himself up, aiming his left hand back at the ship. Then he raised his right hand and snapped again. The hundreds of black balls flew from his arm, arcing up to the ship and tearing it apart. Scylla stared in shock as the entire back section of the other airship fell off, and both pieces began to fall down. Romulus still had a dozen or so balls orbiting his left arm. He wiped away the blood from his face with his right hand and turned to Scylla. "Go turn our core air back on. I don't know how long it'll be before I pass out." Scylla nodded and turned back to the control panel, flipping the switches. The enemy ship passed their airship a few hundred feet to their right. Romulus looked at the balls orbiting his arm, then up to Scylla. "You did well, Scylla," he said. "You should be—" A final beam of light shot from the wreckage of the School of Light's airship. It was smaller and dimmer than the others, but it scored a direct hit on Romulus's left arm. He jerked back, and the balls along his arm all detonated at once. The ship below Scylla exploded in a mass of timber and core air. Scylla ducked down to avoid the explosion coming from the deck below. Their airship listed to the side, then began to fall out of the sky. Scylla could see Romulus's body had already fallen off the ship, heading towards the ground thousands of feet below. She immediately jumped over the railing and angled herself through the air towards Romulus. The ship began making its way after her as she free fell through the air. Scylla looked back at the debris falling down and clapped her hands, repurposing their energy to make her fall even faster. She caught Romulus just 1,000 feet before the ground. His left arm was nothing but a bloody stump. Scylla wrapped her legs around him and clapped her hands together, turning their fall into a float. What was left of the airship passed by on her left, the wreckage so huge it was almost magnificent. It crashed to the floor of the plateau below her and exploded, the core air canisters reacting with the air in a huge explosion. Scylla clapped again, giving them some horizontal motion to avoid the wreckage. What seemed like an eternity later, they hit the ground. Scylla checked Romulus over as she'd been trained. He was barely breathing. "Romulus?" Scylla asked. She was shocked to see him open his eyes. "Scylla, you survived. Good." His breath caught in his throat, and he mouthed wordlessly. You have to return to the School of Attraction and tell Merton what happened here. He must know." Scylla sat back, shocked at the tears in her eyes. "Romulus, I'm sorry." "There's no time for that," Romulus said. "If Merc doesn't get word within 2 weeks, it will mean war with the School of the Sound. You must tell him what happened." Romulus trailed off, his breathing shallow. Then it stopped. "Romulus?" Scylla asked. "Romulus?" There was no answer. Sila looked around and realized with a sinking sensation where she was. The Adala Plateau.
I hope you all enjoyed this story. A big shout out to Maureen Garcia on Patreon, Lilith Scyther, and of course Melissa Priol, my first Patreon backer. Thank you guys so much for all you do. I hope you all enjoyed the story. I don't know that I'll have a part 2 coming necessarily, but if I think of one and I get, inspired, then I might have another one coming, especially if this one gets, good reviews and all that stuff. If you guys like it, it gets much views. Yeah, so leave a like if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment, and I'm going to get out of these woods, so. And as I'm escaping these woods with my life, I'd just like to give an extra shout out to Ian and Jay, Lisa B, Reagan Devereaux. Some of you guys have been really amazing commenters and really supportive of me, and I really appreciate it. So I just want to give a special shout out to you guys, and I'm sure dozens that I'm missing as well. So you're the best, and I really appreciate all the amazing comments. Oh, and as always, I hope you've enjoyed your time on Worchester Street. Alright, I'm gonna get out of these woods, because this is creepy as anything.